Okay, let's get started. It's great to see you all here. About a week ago, I was giving a lecture in my class, and I said, we have just seen some of the most dramatic changes in American grand strategy that you will experience that I've experienced in my lifetime, that you'll see in your lifetime. This is an astonishingly important time in grand strategy. And then AGS Council emailed me and said, well, if that's the case, why aren't we doing any events on this? And they said, couldn't you find somebody knowledgeable to talk about this? And I said, no, but I could probably get you Hal Brands.
Yeah. Saw that one coming.
Yes, exactly. Hal, who is a great friend of the program, but this might be the first time that you're on this side of the podium as a guest, as opposed Hal helped us launch the program about a decade ago. And of course, he's on every one of our syllabi, and he's out with a new book just now. He's a professor at Johns Hopkins, but he's also a columnist with Bloomberg, and he writes prolifically across all the important outlets, consults with the government. He's an international resource. We're very lucky to have you. Thank you, Hal, for coming.
Thanks for having me. Good to be back.
So my question is, how were you able to orchestrate it as part of your book rollout? This is the book, Eurasian Century, just out now, to get the President of the United States to engage in 19th century geopolitics that makes your book seem relevant. So explain how you did that.
I have a knack for doing this. So the book I wrote before this was about why China might invade Taiwan, and it came out 2 days before Nancy Pelosi went to Taiwan in August 2022. And this one is about the evolution of international politics over the last 120 years, with Ukraine really at the center of it. And of course, Ukraine is at the center of it today. But maybe I'll just make one serious point about this. It is really striking the degree to which Ukraine has been at the heart of all of the great global clashes of the past 110 years. It was central to Germany's plans to build a big European empire in World War I and World War II. It was Ukraine that, when it bolted the Soviet Union in late 1991, basically sealed the fate of the system. And of course, it's at the center of the contest between the US and Russia and sort of the autocratic bloc more broadly today. And so it really is one of those cases where history is rhyming if it's not exactly repeating itself.
So give us the short version of the book's argument. And in particular, imagine you're trying to convince somebody who hears President Trump and Vice President Vance say, we really don't have a dog in this fight. We really don't care who rules in that region of the world. Why should we care who rules at the center of Eurasia?
So the short version is that all of the great global struggles of the past century plus have been clashes for dominance within Eurasia and then the water around it, because Eurasia is really the strategic center of global affairs. It's where most of the world's people live, where most of the world's economic resources are found, where most of the world's military potential is. And so the great nightmare of American strategists during the 20th century was that some bad guy or group of bad guys would conquer Eurasia or the most economically valuable parts of it, and then they would use that as a platform to coerce, perhaps even attack, even countries across the oceans. And of course, that's more or less what happened in World War I and World War II, where conflicts that started in faraway places ended up creating insecurity that radiated out across the Atlantic or across the Pacific and ultimately drew the United States in. And then the lesson really of the world wars and more particularly the Cold War was that only the United States has the ability and the power to hold and maintain a stable balance of power in multiple parts of Eurasia at once. And so it's really been U.S. engagement through the U.S. alliance system and forward military deployments in places like Europe and East Asia that has created the climate of the last 80 years, where we haven't had great power wars, where the world hasn't fallen apart in the way that it did twice in the past 20th century. And so the great danger is that if the United States were to pull back from those commitments, then we could see the world unravel again, as it did a couple of times in a generation.
Okay, but there's at least two available counter arguments that have some tradition and some pull in American tradition that would see it a different way. So let me ask you about both of those. The first would be Mahan's view that says that may be a problem if you're Germany, but if you're the United States, a big island, all you need is to control the sea lanes, and then you can prosper and you can allow them to kill themselves in the heartland. So why isn't Mahan right? And why wouldn't we be more true to our roots if we followed the American?
Yeah. Well, I would say that's Mahanism rather than Mahan, right? So it's the way that Mahan is sometimes interpreted, but it's not actually what Mahan argued, right? And so Mahan basically believed that the problem with allowing, first he worried a lot about Russia, and later it was Germany and Japan, to dominate sort of the regions of Eurasia across the sea from the United States, is that then they would have the unimpeded ability to build navies and project naval power in ways that would allow them to contest American control of the Atlantic and the Pacific, and interdict American sea lanes and do all sorts of things that would be injurious to the United States. And so in some ways, Mahan is really one of the earliest American advocates of a forward defense. That is, a defense on the far side of the Atlantic or the Pacific Ocean. And what he basically said is the United States needs to be dominant in the Western Hemisphere, and it needs to prevent any other power from being dominant in Europe or the Far East. Because once you control those shores, you can project naval power across them, which of course is what happened during the 20th century.
Okay, there's another tradition or another argument that Americans have made. In fact, an American who was sitting right there 2 months ago, Bridge Colby, made this argument, and I think he was channeling some views in the administration. He, as you know, has been nominated to be the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, so he might be in a position of influence. And he argued two things, and I've heard, again, President Trump and Vice President Vance say more or less the same thing. First, the last 80 years have been horrible for the United States. We've been exploited, and it's American carnage. We've fought wars that we didn't need to fight. Our wealth and our lives have been spilt for no good purpose. And so what you're holding up as a golden era is what is the bad stuff we want to get away from. That's point one. Point two is Europe can handle the Eurasia problem because our hands have to be preoccupied with the Asia problem. So we're going to do a division of labor, give Europe the Ukraine and Eurasia problem, and we'll do Taiwan. Though he argued more or less that sitting right there. So why isn't that a better way?
I think it depends on how far you take those arguments. And so I have a certain sympathy for the argument that, you know, a number of the interventions that the United States carried out after 2001 certainly didn't turn out like people wanted or that people planned. And I would label certainly the Iraq invasion to have been a mistake. And in retrospect, I think Afghanistan is more complicated. I think Iraq is complicated too, but I think Afghanistan is more complicated still. But you can say, I am against wars to install friendly regimes in Iraq or Afghanistan, and also say, I am in favor of American commitment to maintain a favorable balance of power to prevent bad guys from dominating those regions. And I think that's really what's on the table today. I don't hear anybody sort of seriously proposing that the United States needs to undertake a lot of heavy footprint military interventions in the Middle East, except maybe for President Trump, right? In Gaza. He just put out a very inspiring video today about how grand the Trump hotel there will be. And the second point I would make is that it is entirely fair to say that U.S. allies, particularly U.S. allies in Europe, have been free riding to a certain degree. Now, it's important to state that free riding, a degree of free riding at least, is the point of American alliances. We long ago concluded we saw what the world looked like when Japan and Germany thought they had to fully provide for their own security, and we don't want to live in that sort of world. But the reality is that Europe is not capable of sustaining Ukraine. It's not capable of balancing Russia at this point. And I fear that if the U.S. simply says, we're done with it, over to you guys, that may actually make it harder for the Europeans to get their act together, because the only way that Europe can balance Russia effectively is through a fair degree of strategic unity. And what we've seen from history is that unity is actually more likely to develop in a climate of American engagement and reassurance than in one in which we say we're done with European security and let all the old rivalries reemerge.
Okay, I'm going to interrupt to make an advertisement. We won't follow up on the Gaza video, which is definitely worth watching. But if you're watching, you're interested, come back tomorrow. Daphne Rand is going to be here speaking, and she'll talk about that, I'm quite sure, and the whole Middle East strategy. Okay, so you answered the Europe needs us side of it, but what about the China side? Maybe Taiwan is just too big of a problem, and we need, this is what Bridge Colby said, yeah, if we could afford to increase defense across the board, if we could double the defense budget the way the Defense Strategy Review Congressional Panel recommended, that'd be great. But he called that magical realism. We don't have that magical thinking anyway. He says, we just have to live, we have to live with constrained resources, and that means prioritize, and that means abandon Ukraine.
Well, levels of defense spending reflect the economic reality, but they also reflect political choice. And there's a colleague of mine at AEI, Todd Harrison, who did the math and concluded that the difference between what the U.S. is spending on defense today, so about 3.2% of GDP, and what it would be spending if it spent 5% of GDP on defense, that's the same increment to the deficit as the Trump tax cuts of 2017. Was it 2017 or 2018 when they were finally passed? I can't remember, right? And so what that indicates is that we have to make political choices about what we value as a society. And we could make a set of political choices, and perhaps we will, that basically says, we're just not going to spend any more on defense because we are unwilling to deal with the trade-offs that would create across other programs or the tax increases that it might involve. But you don't have to go back to like 1960s levels of taxation to get to a point where you could spend significantly more on defense. It would require going back to 2015, 2016 levels of taxation. And so it's not nearly as much of a leap as some of the critics sometimes make it seem.
Okay, so now let's talk about the Trump administration's coming in. Do you detect a grand strategy that Trump is trying to follow, that either some version of this or some other version? Is there coherent logic there that you can spell out for us?
It's hard to say, I think, because with Trump, there are always so many things going on at once. And Trump also has a habit of proposing things that are radical, and then when they run into some sort of resistance, ends up reverting to something that's not the mean, but is somewhat closer to the mean. If we're talking about Ukraine in particular, I think there is a logic underpinning some of the stuff the Trump administration has done over the past couple weeks. And the way I would sort of characterize it is you're shifting from talk therapy to shock therapy and dealing with the European allies. And you're basically saying it's going to be over to you guys, whether you like it or not, and seeing if that finally produces the investments in European security that Trump has been after for a long time. It is trying to pursue a broader de-escalation with Russia, not just in Ukraine, but perhaps across other issues, including in sort of the broader Eastern European security environment, maybe in nuclear arms control as well, both because Trump thinks those are good things in their own right and because he hopes they will allow the United States to at least slow the convergence between Russia and China that so many people have been writing about and worrying about over the past couple of years. And he's trying to put into action a principle that he has literally been talking about for 40 years, which is the principle that the United States should not provide global security for free. It should only do so if it is receiving direct economic payments from the beneficiaries of that security. That's an argument that he first made during the Iran-Iraq war in the 1980s, when he basically said the Kuwaitis should pay us for escorting their tankers through the Persian Gulf. And he's been making a version of that ever since. And so when you put all those things together, I think they are consonant with Trump's long-standing views of foreign policy. And there's a certain coherence there in the sense that they all kind of go together. I think it is likely to be ineffective for reasons that we can talk about. But I think that is the unifying logic from what we've seen around Ukraine, at least in the past couple of weeks.
It's interesting. You described his outreach to Russia in very minimalist terms. Some people have said he's trying to do a reverse Kissinger, where he goes and actually hives Russia off from China and creates a new strategic relationship. Do you see evidence of that?
Well, I mean, I think it's a matter of degree, right? So there is certainly a view within the administration that Russia and China are doing more and more together, that the reason that Russia has become more dependent on China is because it's become more isolated from the West as a result of the Ukraine war. So ending the war and normalizing relations with Russia is the key to dealing with that Sino-Russian alignment. And then how ambitious you are, I don't know that there is sort of a unified view on that. I think the truly ambitious folks in the administration think, yeah, look, Russia and China are natural rivals along their border. The Russians should be working with us to contain China rather than working with China to contain us. I think that's really a stretch. I think the more reasonable or the more realistic version is that perhaps you can simply give Putin a little bit less of an incentive to say, give away Russia's crown jewels in a military technological sense to China while accepting ever greater degrees of economic and technological dependence. I think there's maybe more of a there on that minimalist version, but even so, I think it's going to be difficult to achieve.
Can you fit Vice President Vance's speech at Munich into this architecture that you just described, where this is the one where he channeled his inner neocon and started to lecture the Europeans about regime change in Europe. So after saying how horrible it was to contemplate regime change in other countries. So does that strand of the administration's strategy fit this grand strategy that you're describing?
In a way, I mean, I think there have always been two strands of the we should work more closely with Russia argument. One of them is kind of the classically geopolitical arguments that we just talked about. And so if you are a practitioner of realpolitik, then maybe you think that there is an argument for closer cooperation with Russia on that count. The second piece, though, is kind of the strand that I think Vance was talking about, which is more of sort of like the culture war piece of it, where we're against woke and Putin's against woke, whereas the Europeans are very woke. And so maybe we have more in common with Russia than we do with Europe. I will say that is, the idea that Russia is sort of this like deeply conservative religious society that shares a lot of values with American social conservatives is patently ridiculous if you spend any time looking at Russia. But nonetheless, it does seem to have caught on among a certain part of the MAGA base. And I think that's the audience that Vance was speaking to.
Well, you may have just anticipated, or that may be the same answer you give to my next question, but let me try it anyway. We teach that personnel is policy. And so when I look at the personnel that the administration has put in place, I can see the logic you're describing, maybe, something that Mike Waltz and Secretary Rubio might try to follow. Maybe with Ratcliffe at the CIA, I'm having a harder time fitting Tulsi Gabbard into that picture, Pete Hegseth into that picture. So when you look at the landscape of folks he's nominated, does the personnel line up with the policy that you've outlined? You're saying you detect that is the president wants to follow?
Well, I think everyone in the administration can agree on sort of the going in proposition, which is that they wish the Ukraine war was over and that the U.S. had to do less to support Ukraine. I think that unites the Asia First people with sort of the Tulsi Gabbard, come home America people. And then most importantly, Trump has made clear it's his preference. And so even sort of the people who would be Reagan Republicans in any other administration, Rubio and Waltz, have to go along with it as well. And so in a way, it's sort of a least common denominator policy across the administration. But I think there are, just to editorialize a little bit, there are varying levels of enthusiasm for this policy. And when poor Marco Rubio looked like he was in a hostage video when he was talking about all the great opportunities for partnering with Putin's Russia after the meeting in Saudi Arabia. And this is, just to be candid, this is a policy that Rubio wouldn't have been caught dead espousing a year ago, right? And so it goes to, I think, the more important theme, which is, yes, personnel is policy, but the defining criterion for service in Trump 2.0 is personal, political, and ideological loyalty to Trump.
Mm-hmm.
And so in a sense, it doesn't actually matter what Gabbard or others think about Ukraine, because I don't think there's anyone in this administration who views their role as playing, the McMaster or the Mattis role in Trump 1.0, which was to, try to gently encourage Trump to go in a better direction when he might have been going wrong. I think now the view is that the staff are there to, enable Trump to go 100 miles an hour on his policy priorities. And that's one of the reasons the pace of action has been so much faster in the first 6 weeks than it was last time around.
One of the things that he campaigned on was a critique of over-interventionism, that particularly last time that we had Republicans, they were too keen to invade other countries. That's why many people were surprised by some of his most dramatic statements regarding, threatening Denmark to take Greenland, time to retake the Panama Canal. Does that element of his foreign policy announcements, anyway, does that fit this larger strategy you're describing?
I think so let me try to put this one in historical terms, and then I'll relate it to the Trump agenda. So there is a long history of the United States trying to consolidate the Western Hemisphere when there is a moment of crisis internationally. And so this happens in World War I, it happens in World War II, it happens in a much longer running and in some cases bloodier fashion during the Cold War as well. And so now that the United States finds itself in an era of competition with China in particular, it's not surprising that an administration is looking to, edge Chinese influence out of the area around the Panama Canal, that it's looking to, secure economic and security interests in Greenland and so on and so forth. I think there are two questions about this, and the second one, I think, most directly answers your question. The first question is, how far is Trump willing to go to do this? And I think what most national security folks in the U.S. would say is that if you are trying to get the Panamanians to be more vigilant about Chinese influence around the canal, or you are trying to get Denmark to do more to secure the sea lanes around Greenland, you don't actually have to threaten to take the place over in order to do that. In fact, the Danes have been telling Trump for the past couple of months, whatever concerns you have, right, about minerals, about security, we're happy to talk, we're happy to do more, and so on and so forth. And Trump has kept saying, no, we need control of these places, sovereign control of these places. And so if he actually were to insist on exerting that control, that wouldn't be so much in sort of the 20th century tradition of American statecraft. It would be more going back to the 19th century tradition of territorial expansion.
Including if we take Canada.
Including if we take
a great 19th century attempt multiple times. Yeah.
So the second question is consolidating the Western Hemisphere viewed as a complement to or a replacement for the tradition of globalism we've seen over the past 80 plus years? And so I think the way that most Cold War policymakers thought about it was that American primacy, dominance, whatever you want to call it in the Western Hemisphere, was the regional foundation that, once firm and secure, allowed the United States to go out in the world and use its power in Europe and Asia and the Middle East and other places. I think some of the people around Trump see it that way. I think others say, even if the United States is dominant in the Western Hemisphere, it's got the biggest, baddest sphere of influence in the world, even if it gets out of Europe and East Asia. And so if the U.S. can, create Fortress Americas by taking Greenland and the Panama Canal and making Canada the 51st state, we just don't need to worry as much about what happens in Ukraine or in the Baltic region or even in the Taiwan Strait. And I have a little bit of a challenge figuring out exactly where Trump is on those issues, because I think his instincts run in a couple different directions.
Well, this was one of the debates or conversation points we had with Bridge Colby, who seemed hard over on the need to defend Taiwan. And I said, you seem more committed to it than President Trump might be, that he might be less convinced that he needs to defend Taiwan. Is that a possible scenario? You seem to hint at that just now.
Yeah, I think there is sort of the Asia First contingent in the Republican Party that believes that the only fight that matters is the fight with China, and that Taiwan is the keystone of that contest. And so if you are going to fight a big war anywhere, you fight a big war in the Taiwan Strait when China tries to take Taiwan. Candidly, however, I think there are a number of folks who have been using the Asia First argument simply as a convenient way of arguing against aid to Ukraine. And it is possible, it's not certain, that some of the folks who are most sort of vociferous about the Asia First strategy might actually find themselves in that category. Trump himself has never cared about Taiwan from a security perspective. He's always looked at it, not always fondly, through an economic perspective, right? He says they're an economic competitor. They stole our chip business, and so on and so forth. And so, I think Trump would find it embarrassing if Xi Jinping were to take Taiwan on his watch. And so he is keen for it not to happen for that reason. But I don't think he looks at Taiwan as a strategic asset, as sort of a critical strategic strong point in the way that Joe Biden talked about it, or folks in the last administration did. The other dimension of this is it comes from the people who say, yes, the U.S. has a very important interest in Taiwan, but our willingness to help Taiwan should be contingent on dramatically higher levels of Taiwanese defense spending.
10%.
10% of GDP, yeah. Right? And because Trump thrives on uncertainty, it is a little bit difficult to tell whether he's putting out a ridiculously high number as a way of motivating Taiwan to get to 4% or something like that, or setting a test that Taiwan is destined to fail. And then you can say, well, we would have liked to help, but they didn't help themselves, and so on and so forth. And so I think that even in an administration where Asia First people are fairly well represented, the sort of ambiguous commitment to Taiwan that the U.S. has always had is probably less solid than it was in the past.
Okay, let's go back to NATO and home in on the Ukraine situation. A lot of what we've seen from the administration over the last 4+ weeks, you could say this is just them trying to get Europe to wake up and do their part. But you could also say this is them saying we don't need NATO and we're going to break NATO forever. Where do you come down on that question?
I think that Trump is ill-disposed toward NATO. He has been complaining about NATO as a racket that allows, these rich, complacent social democracies to leech off the United States for as long as he has been a public figure. And so I don't think Trump is committed to the transatlantic alliance in the way that basically every other president since 1945 or so 1949 has been committed. They thought that it was a really important pillar of American strategy, and sort of thought it was unthinkable that it would go away, or that you would let it go away. That said, I am a little bit skeptical of the idea that Trump is going to just sort of wake up tomorrow and withdraw from NATO. And the reason I'm skeptical is that Trump's go-to diplomatic move in every area of endeavor is threatening to shoot the hostage, right? It's threatening to withdraw from the trade deal, threatening to withdraw from the alliance, right? Threatening to put 25% tariffs. And once you actually shoot the hostage, you can't collect the ransom. And Trump does have things he wants from Europe. He wants them to buy more American gas. He wants them to go easier on their treatment of American tech giants. He wants them to follow the United States more closely on economic and technological ties with China. And it's hard for me to see how he gets any of those things if he deliberately breaks the alliance. Now, he may still do a lot of things that will damage the alliance, right? He'll talk down the value of the Article 5 commitment. He will get into public fights with European figures. He will find a variety of ways of sort of humiliating allies. The poor president of Poland flew across the Atlantic for what was supposed to be a 90-minute meeting with Trump and got 10 minutes and then had to turn around and go home. So I'm certainly not saying that Trump will be good for the Atlantic alliance. But if you, this may come off as the most naive statement in the world in like 2 weeks, but if you force me to bet $1 on will Trump withdraw from NATO or not, I would bet against that.
Okay, but he may have found a way of killing the hostage and still getting the value out of the hostage with the Ukrainian rare earth deal. So this brings us to that portion of it. How, when you first saw the deal announced or floated, the version that was submitted by Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, not the version that Zelensky floated 2 years ago, but the one that the Trump administration took to Kyiv. How did you assess that then, and how do you assess the version you're seeing, leaked today?
The initial U.S. proposal, the one that was sort of given to Zelensky and then it was reportedly urged upon him that he should sign it immediately without consulting anyone, was a remarkable document because it committed Ukraine to providing the U.S. with up to $500 billion in future resource revenues, not just from rare earths, but from a variety of Ukrainian resources, even though that dwarfs the amount of aid that the United States has provided to Ukraine over the past 3 years. And it came with none of the forward-looking security guarantees that I think Zelensky had in mind when he raised this idea with Trump back in, was it September 2024? And Zelensky, I think, with sort of understandably looked at that and basically said, I can't possibly sign this, right? This is basically signing away Ukraine's future wealth in exchange for nothing, right? In exchange for services rendered by the United States to date. There is now a revised version of the document that apparently has been agreed to, although not yet signed by all of the parties. And we're basing all this on news reports in the past 2 hours. And so this is a provisional statement. It appears to be an effort to preserve the symbolism of the document while actually punting on all of the substance. And so it looks like what Trump and Zelensky are going to sign is basically a framework agreement that commits to sort of the principle of developing this joint fund that will be filled up by Ukrainian resource revenues up to a total of $500 billion. But all of the important details will be negotiated and agreed to at a later date. And so the way that I am interpreting this with the information that we had as of 4:58 p.m. Is that this is sort of the classic on-brand Trump move of making an enormous ask, settling for something far less than that, and proclaiming a big victory, right? And so he will get the symbolism of saying, I have secured lots of money for the United States down the road, even though it's not entirely clear what the details of that agreement will be. I'll also add that it's just not entirely clear that any of this rare earth wealth is actually going to be extracted on a time frame that would be meaningful. Some of it's in territory that Russia currently occupies. Some of it's in areas where sort of the economic viability of extracting it has never been assessed. And so the idea that there's $500 billion out there, maybe, but that wealth is essentially hypothetical at this point.
That number is pretty close to the amount that the Russians have lost or that are frozen in Western banks. Is that just a coincidence, or do you think the U.S. may have Trump may have his designs on that?
Maybe. I mean, I think it's about what it's like. Well, I guess maybe the amount has grown. It was originally 300 and change, and I guess it's grown with interest since the war started. I have to imagine that the Russians are going to ask for that back as part of any deal to end the war. And
it would be remarkable if Trump gave it back, though, right? Because that's not on brand for him to return.
Well, I mean, most of it's being held by the Europeans, so it would be on brand for Trump to give back something that he doesn't actually control.
Yeah, fair enough. I withdraw the critique. Yes,
but so I think that Trump, who styles himself the master negotiator, will use this for leverage, and will try to get the Russians to give something up in order to get their foreign reserve assets back. Is it a one-for-one trade or something where sort of the rough parallel between the 500 billion and the 300 to 500 billion in frozen assets come into play? I don't.
Your assessment, which sounds plausible to me, that Trump might settle for a lot less than what he started with, makes a lot of sense, except that it seems to be happening super fast, right? This is what I would have predicted after a couple of weeks, months of fruitless negotiations. This whole thing is, wrapping up in episode 2 rather than in an 8-episode miniseries. So why would it be happening so fast? Why wouldn't Trump sort of play this strand along, squeeze Ukraine a little bit longer? What accounts for the speed in your mind?
Well, I mean, Trump has been pretty clear that he wants the war over yesterday since 2023. And I do think he is sincere when he basically says he looks at the situation, he sees these huge numbers of casualties, and he thinks that's a shame, and he wants the war to come to an end so the killing can stop. I think we can take him at his word on that. I also think to some degree he must understand that U.S. leverage and Ukrainian leverage is not increasing with time, right? Mm-hmm. And so the Ukrainians are, the good news is that they're losing slowly. The bad news is that they're losing on the battlefield. And there is very little reason to expect that trajectory to change over the next 6 months or a year. At some point in the next few months, the Ukrainians are also going to work their way through the tranche of aid that was approved by the U.S. Congress in April 2024. And after that, they're going to have serious problems coming up with air defenses and other things they need. And moreover, if you talk to defense experts in the United States, they will tell you that there is not an inexhaustible supply of these things in Pentagon warehouses. The United States has run through a lot of its stockpiles. And so when you put all that together with the fact that I think Trump just wants to focus on other things, that accounts for a lot of the speed that has happened here. I think there are 2 problems, though. The first is that while some of the things that the Trump administration have said make sense substantively, it does not make sense to say them at the beginning of the negotiation, right? Mm-hmm. And so I'm talking about Hegseth's speech in Brussels at the Ukraine Contact Group a couple of weeks ago, where he basically said, Ukraine's not going to get its territory back. It's not going to join NATO. It's not going to get a lot more U.S. aid. And even if there is a European peacekeeping mission in Ukraine, it's not going to have U.S. forces, and it's not going to be a NATO mission, which implies no Article 5 guarantee for those forces if they are attacked. Candidly, I don't think the Biden administration would disagree substantively with any of those things, or a Harris administration would disagree with that. But presumably, those are things you would try to sort of bargain away over the course of the negotiation rather than sort of giving them away up front. The second problem is that I don't know that Putin may actually want to see all 8 episodes in the miniseries, right? And he can tell that there is very limited appetite in the United States for more aid to Ukraine. He knows the Europeans can't immediately fill the gap. He knows that Ukraine's manpower problems are significantly more severe than Russia's manpower problems at this point. And so I think he may be incentivized to quickly move into negotiations as a process because it allows him to break the international isolation that Russia has been under. He gets on the phone with Trump and they talk, and then Trump announces what they talked about, and the Europeans freak out because they weren't consulted and things like that. All that's good from Putin's perspective. But he may want to drag out the resolution of this over a period of months, and he may ask for really big things, right? He may ask for revisions to NATO's force posture in Eastern Europe as part of a larger settlement of the disagreements between Russia and the West. And so I think one of the really interesting questions is what happens if and when these timelines don't line up, right? Trump wants to get a deal done within the next 6 weeks. I think Putin's timeline is more like 6 months.
Well, just to be clear, the deal that Trump today said we basically agreed we're going to sign it. That's just the deal on rare earth that sort of gets the U.S. and Ukraine back to where they were on January 15th, where we were on the same side of the table. and it wasn't clear we've been on the same side of the table since. But it gets us not much closer, it seems to me, to a peace agreement. So how do you go from the rare earth agreement to a peace agreement? What's the next step in a Trump strategy to achieve that?
Well, the rare earth agreement, I mean, whatever its sort of practical limitations, is important just in the sense that it, if only momentarily, gets the prospect of an outright rupture between the U.S. and Ukraine off the table and out of the news cycle for a little bit. And that's helpful because if you have that sort of rupture, like there won't be a peace deal between Russia and Ukraine because the Russians will simply win the war and impose whatever terms they want to on Ukraine. And so this at least positions the United States to try to negotiate some sort of deal with Russia. Now it's notable that I said the United States there because it's not clear that the Ukrainians or the Europeans are going to be allowed into these negotiations. What Trump seems to have in mind is a great power bargain between the U.S. and Russia, where the Ukrainians and Europeans are consulted, but they don't get to sit at the adults' table with the U.S. and Russia. Can
you think of a historical case where peace was done that way successfully?
I can think of a lot of cases where it was done that way. It doesn't usually end well for the smaller power that's left out of those negotiations, right? So that there is a certain similarity to the deal that Nixon and Kissinger negotiated in Vietnam in 1973, which was basically foisted upon the South Vietnamese government, which for understandable reasons objected because it saw that its chances for survival were going to be very low under this sort of deal. But it's not unusual for the interests of proxies and patrons to diverge at a certain point. And I do think what the Trump administration is sort of saying is our interests in Ukraine and its interests are not the same. We'll do the best we can for them, but ultimately it's our interests that need to be served in this deal. The framework that was sort of talked about after the first meeting between U.S. and Russian officials in Saudi Arabia last week sort of envisions a three-part approach to this. Part one, get a ceasefire. Part two, elections in Ukraine, which has been under martial law. And so they sort of missed their elections in 2023 as a result of this. And then move on to a more comprehensive agreement. There are a lot of problems with this. And so problem one is that one of the reasons Ukraine has had martial law in place is that allows it to essentially seal its borders and prevent its military-age male population from leaving the country. If Ukraine lifts martial law as part of a process that is meant to lead to a peace deal that many Ukrainians suspect will be disadvantageous to Ukraine, you could have a real outflow of the manpower that Ukraine is going to need to continue defending itself. And so you could end up with a situation where you get a ceasefire, martial law is lifted, and wouldn't you know it, Ukraine emerges much weaker 6 months or a year down the road. It's also not clear, by the way, that Zelensky will agree to lift martial law and hold elections, because I think he knows very well he would lose those elections if they were held under current conditions. And so there are a lot of problems associated with all of this. I think that the Trump administration has been clear on what it wants, right? It wants the war to end. I don't think it has a particularly good view of how it thinks that's going to happen or how it can bring together, sort of the combination of pressures and concessions that would be necessary to bring it about.
Okay, I'm going to ask my last question and then start preparing your questions. Elliot is the mic runner, and so while you're answering this question, I'll look and pick who's going to ask questions from the audience. What did you think of the Iraq surge? No. This is a private joke that I have been having.
Widely understood, though, apparently.
Yes, apparently. Okay, so no, I want to make you do something that historians claim they don't like to do. Make a prediction. So 6 months from now, what will be the status of the Ukraine situation? Ukraine, which you've identified in this book, available for purchase everywhere, is at the heart of it. What will it be at the heart of a stable Western leaning alliance like we've seen in the last 80 years, or will it be at the heart of something much darker, heart of darkness? They would answer that, and I'll pick folks from the audience.
We won't. So if Ukraine is on the right trajectory, if it's on its way to being integrated into the West as a politically viable, militarily defensible, economically sustainable entity, we certainly will not be able to call that in 6 months. The only conclusive outcome we will know in 6 months is if there is a really bad peace deal that leads to a rupture between the U.S. and Ukraine and potentially a collapse of Ukrainian morale. I still think that's unlikely to happen in the next 6 months. I think the Ukrainians can keep fighting by themselves for 6 months without too much problem. But we certainly won't know if sort of a good peace deal has been achieved, because that will depend on things like what are the post-conflict arrangements to draw Ukraine toward the West, right? What is Ukraine's political and diplomatic status after the war ends? What kind of security guarantees or what kind of peacekeeping force is put in place, right? What are sort of the physical barriers that are placed along the line of contact so that it's not easily violated by the Russians or by either side? I find it very hard to imagine we will have conclusive answers to those questions in 6 months. I think we will have an answer in 6 months to the question of whether the U.S. and Russia can work out a ceasefire over this. I mean, I would be, if a ceasefire is going to happen, I'd be kind of surprised if it doesn't happen by the end of the summer, which is basically the period that we're talking about. So I can see a scenario where that happens. I can see a scenario where it comes apart for reasons that we've talked about. But I think that's the only thing we'll have certainty on.
All right. So Elliot's seatmate somehow got first in line. So there.
Thank you so much for speaking with us today. My question is related to your statement that Europe without the U.S. would be incapable of securing safety for the Ukrainian people. I'm wondering if you could speak to what steps Europeans would have to take to fill the gap that the U.S. would leave behind in Ukraine.
So it's not a mystery what these things are, right? And so if the Europeans produced more ammunition, if they produced more of the long-range fires that the U.S. has provided Ukraine, if they produced more air defenses, they would be better capable of, filling the role the U.S. has played in supplying Ukraine. The problem is that the European defense industrial base is in terribly weak shape. So we read a lot about sort of the frailty of the U.S. defense industrial base. Europe is in a much worse place. And European defense spending is rising, investments in their defense industrial base are rising, but it's going to take years for European production to get to a point where the Europeans would be able to sustain Ukraine, especially if they are now concluding that they are going to have to defend themselves by themselves. And so, Germany is going to want first claim on the things that German industry produces as opposed to sending those to Ukraine. There are other pieces of U.S. aid for Ukraine that candidly will be very hard for the Europeans to fill on any conceivable time frame. U.S. intelligence support for Ukraine, I think, being the best example of that. But if you look out 3 to 5 years, you can probably see your way to a path where the Europeans could provide a lot of material support. The challenge is they can't do it on sort of the 6 month, the 2 to 3 year time frame that seems most relevant right now.
No.
Hi, thank you so much. So a few days ago with the new German elections, the new chancellor said that he was wanting a broader strategic decoupling from the United States. To what extent do you evaluate European statements like these as similar blustering to what Trump is doing towards them? And if they were to become true, if Europe were to move away from the United States, what would that look like for broader European security moving forward?
So this is not the first time that we have heard a German chancellor say that Europe is going to have to look after itself in the past decade. Angela Merkel said very similar things after Trump was first elected in 2016. And, subsequent German conduct did not make it appear that they were in a terrible hurry to develop the capabilities they would need to look after themselves in a post-American world. I do think there is a much stronger sentiment this time that whether or not Trump himself is going to break the transatlantic alliance in the next 4 years, there's no going back to the transatlantic relationship as it existed prior to, you take your pick, November 5th, 2024, or November 2016, or 1991, or whenever, because there is clearly a degree of U.S. disenchantment, not just with the specifics of the relationship, but with sort of the larger fact of the relationship. And that has now been embodied in a president that the United States has elected twice. And so you can no longer convince yourself, if you're a European leader, that this is all an aberration and that what we saw from President Biden is sort of the true norm in American statecraft in the 21st century. The reality, though, is that, and as Meretz and every other responsible European leader knows, I mean, Europe has a tremendous distance to go to actually have any sort of strategic autonomy. NATO is built around U.S. command and control, around U.S. logistics, around U.S. enablers, and all sorts of other capabilities. And so if NATO really does go away, it's going to take European militaries years to develop that stuff. And candidly, it's not entirely clear to me whether Europe will do that as an entity, or whether you will simply have individual states and collections of states that band together to try to provide for their own defense. And so I can certainly imagine a bloc, Poland, the Baltic states, maybe some of the Scandinavian countries that come together to try to provide collective defense, and so the eastern and northern front of NATO. But they might simply decide that it's still too much work getting Italy and Spain to come along, for instance. And so you could very easily see a fracturing of European strategic identity after a U.S. departure.
Andrew.
Thanks so much for this. I want to ask you to make another prediction. What do you think the future of the Republican foreign policy brand is after Trump? Will it snap back? Will MAGA complete the takeover? And if so, how is it distinct from the more traditional sort of Reagan era platform?
They're going to bring fever back.
Is there any
That'll
room for
solve everything, right?
the dinosaurs that bite the blue carpet before we sink into oblivion? Yes.
So I think there's going to be a really interesting fight for sort of the foreign policy identity of the Republican Party after Trump leaves. I think that, if you look at the 2024 primaries, 30 or 40% of the Republican Party voted for Nikki Haley, right, who espouses a much more sort of traditionally Reaganite, George W. Bush style of leadership. If you talk to the older guard of Republicans on Capitol Hill, I think that is still the dominant mode of thinking. You should comment on this because you know this group better than I do. It's different among people who were elected more recently, but I think what most unifies Republicans right now is unwillingness to get into a major fight on these issues with Trump, right? And he exercises a degree of dominance of the party that is suppressing some of these disagreements. But once he's gone, it is hard for me to imagine that the new leader of the America First wing of the party will be as personally dominant and willing to punish perceived disloyalty as Trump is. And so, all this is a long way of saying that I think the fight for the future of the Republican Party on foreign policy is far from over.
I would just add that first, I've been wrong in predicting on this question for the last 10 years, as you never stopped reminding me. So yes. So the second is, though, that Trump's version is based on a false premise and a false promise. The false premise is that the last 80 years have been terrible for the U.S. That's just not true. And the false promise is that when we break everything, we won't miss it, that we'll actually do way better. And so the answer to your question is, if I'm wrong and that he's actually right, after we break everything, we'll be so happy that it's gone, then it's MAGA for now until I die. But if it turns out that they break things that produce bad outcomes, demonstrably bad outcomes, maybe even on a scale worse than the Iraq War or something for the United States, then you might see the old guard of Republicans have another chance.
Yeah. So, wait, can I add something? Because I think this is really important. Trump surely understands at some level that if Ukraine goes down on his watch, it will be his Afghanistan, which did nothing good for
Abbygate,
right?
On steroids.
Exactly. And so there is political peril for Trump in cutting a truly terrible deal that sees Ukraine crumble. That said, in a broader perspective, what Trump and sort of the hardest core part of the MAGA movement get right is that if the United States stops providing global security and global public goods, and the world falls apart as a result of that, Americans will be the last people to get hurt as a result of that. It'll be terrible for countries on the front lines in Europe and Asia, in the Middle East. The world will become less prosperous, but the U.S. is better situated than any other country in the world to survive and even thrive in those conditions. And what we've seen in previous eras, when the U.S. pulled back from strategic commitments in Europe after World War I, it was 20 years before those chickens came home to roost for the United States. And so it's entirely possible that sort of a MAGA retrenchment could have negative consequences, but we don't come to regret it for another decade or more.
Okay. Abigail.
Okay. Yeah, thank you so much for coming. My question is about some of the policy changes at the Department of Defense. Two that come to mind are the decision to fire a lot of senior officials, namely the JAGs and General Brown, and then also the suggestion to pull funding from some of the combatant commands around the world, so pulling some support funding. And it sort of flips the question on its head of like, how much do we want to support our allies to how much will our allies have confidence in us if we keep making such radical / slightly frightening changes to the structure of our defense system?
I would put those two things in slightly different categories. I'm far more worried about the first one than I am about the second one. I think the second one falls in the category of periodic reallocation of resources within sort of the U.S. defense scheme, and it's not necessarily illegitimate or wrong to be thinking about that stuff. On the personnel changes in particular at DoD, the problem is not that the president fired General Brown and a number of other senior commanders. It's what he fired them for, right? Which appears to be being on the wrong side of political issues that President Trump feels strongly about. And that this is something I draw on my deep expertise on civil-military relations on to provide this answer. That's a I'm not sure if it's a back door or a front door to the politicization of the military, because it will encourage two unhelpful tendencies. One, senior officers will not want to give the president sort of hard advice because they are worried about being caught out and fired as a result of it. And two, it will encourage certain ambitious folks to become more explicitly political to align themselves with the president, whether it's Trump or somebody else who is likely to promote them to the next big job. And so I don't think either of those trends is healthy for U.S. security.
You now have a sense of what it's like to co-teach with House. One long subtweeting, trolling experience. Okay. Yes.
Mr. Brands, thank you for being with us. I do have a question. I wanted to say something about what you just said. Couldn't you make the argument that it was a problem that General Brown was on the side of a political issue at all? And then my question is completely unrelated. You mentioned that you think for Trump, not letting Taiwan fall to China is more about personal prestige, and he doesn't really view it as the unsinkable aircraft carrier that Taiwan was viewed as for a lot of the Cold War. How right do you think Trump is to kind of discount Taiwan's geostrategic importance for the United States? Do you think there's anything to that?
So on the first one, it would have been Brown's fault if he had endorsed Kamala Harris for president or sort of engaged in overtly political acts. But as best I can determine, he was sort of cashiered for being on the wrong side of the DEI issue in particular, where he was not staking out a particularly sort of capital P political position, but was simply sort of responding to the climate of the administration that he was working for. And then the administration changes and that is out of favor and he is pushed aside at the same time that a number of other top officials are pushed aside. So I'd put that in a different category. I'm not sure that General Brown, sort of committed a civil military relations foul that would justify being pushed out. On the
I can't resist. I'll confirm he did not commit a civil military foul. And he did not even block any of the DEI reversals that Hegseth was doing. So he was working effectively with Hegseth. Hegseth said he was working effectively with him, and yet he still was fired.
That's about right. So Brown loyally served one president and was trying to loyally serve another, right?
Yes,
and,
exactly. And still was. Yeah.
On the Taiwan issue, I think it is possible to exaggerate Taiwan's strategic significance. I don't think it's the case that if China gets a hold of Taiwan, like the rest of the Western Pacific is gone and we're going to find ourselves fighting from Hawaii in the next war with China. I do think, though, that it has real strategic significance. I mean, when you look at the map, you see that it's right at the middle of the first island chain, which means that if China grabs it, it has easier access to the open Pacific. It's got access to the good deep water on the eastern side of Taiwan, which makes it easier to push submarines out, and then you can interdict U.S. Military movements into the region. It makes it harder to defend Japan and the Philippines, right? The Japanese will tell you that Taiwan is an existential issue for them because if it falls, there's no way they can defend some of their southwestern islands and so on and so forth. And so I would say just that the loss of Taiwan makes everything else the United States would try to do in that region more difficult.
David.
Hey, Tom.
Hey, David.
If I could just editorialize on the two of the part of the conversation. One, it seems to me that Brown, his greatest sin was that he articulately spoke to his own lived experience, and that is not tolerated in this new administration. That was the sin. That's why he got fired. The second thing, as for the firings, I think I'd like to hear your view about what disturbs me most is the TJAGs getting fired for no basis in anything. And to me, and our colleague Charlie Dunlap wrote about this articulately and at length this week. To me, it's a signal of a move towards lawlessness and an endorsement of lawlessness in the military. And that is, I'd love to hear your views, but to me, it's an extremely dangerous and ill-advised military strategy. The question I wanted to ask was whether you talked about a good analogy for two powers negotiating around one of the parties. Why isn't the best analogy the bad deal that Trump struck with the Taliban? The most recent one and the only one that he really concluded during his first term, and which saw an exceptionally bad deal made. Second, even none of the terms that actually were imposed on the other party, the Taliban, in this case would be Russia, were ever enforced against them. And then we withdrew and did more than the agreement even required us to do in terms of leaving, which is what Trump wants to do to Ukraine. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on the analogy between a possible Ukraine deal and Trump's deal with the Taliban.
On the first comment, I'll just say that Duke is fortunate to have such an eminent CivMil expert as Charlie Dunlap. But you should answer that one because you know more about that subject than I do. Yeah, I mean, I think there are. If you're looking for the worst case scenario, then I think Afghanistan is the analogy. I guess the only thing that gives me, and I agree that all of the dimensions you flagged are the right ones to be worried about. I think the only thing that gives me a little bit of pause is that Trump has now had the opportunity to see how that played out and see how politically disastrous it was for Biden. And because we are 1 month into Trump's term, a deal cut along those lines puts the fall of Ukraine on Trump's watch rather than on the watch of the person who comes after, where he got sort of politically lucky in that respect that it happened under Biden. So I worry about a lot of the same dynamics, but I have to think that Trump is at least aware of the fact that he doesn't want to replay the Biden experience in Afghanistan.
When Secretary Pompeo was here, we asked him about the deal. He said, well, the deal that we struck, he imagined would take 10 years to play out. And so was it a bad deal? Well, we never thought that we would be implementing it within a year's time. I said, did Trump feel that way? and he didn't have an answer. Okay.
That was the most disingenuous part of the whole talk with Pompeo. I mean, it was farcical because all of the guidelines for when we were going to withdraw troops were actually exceeded during Pompeo's watch.
Yeah.
You opened one of your recent writings with a quote from Truman about we need to pay the price of peace lest we pay the price of war. My question is, do you think there's any possibility that there's a through line in Trump's grand strategy at this point that the United States' teleological objectives of building a world safe for human rights is the price for peace, and we're paying that in reconciling our relationships with Russia and China? Or is the undercurrent of Trump's policy right now simply he just wants a world in which he's free to pursue any imperial objectives that he desires, and he just wants to be East Asia to Oceania and Eurasia?
I don't think Trump is highly motivated by the promotion of human rights and liberal values overseas. I don't think that's the lens through which he views the world. And you're certainly not going to see Trump describing the geopolitical lineup in the way that Biden did, where it's this great battle between democracies and autocracies. I think Trump does have more of sort of a 19th century view of international politics in that sense, where the values are sort of beside the point, or at least they're not at center stage, because you have to cut deals with nasty regimes in order to secure your economic and security interests. And I might say that I think that's a mistake, that I think that the United States actually derives great power and influence from promoting its values in the international system, that it's not a coincidence that all of our closest allies are liberal democracies and so on and so forth, or fairly liberal democracies. But that's not the way that Trump sees it. So I don't see him pursuing that vision.
Okay, we have time for the last two questions here and then here.
So I'm interested to know, we have a rising European right, pretty successful right now. We just saw the AfD take 20% or so of the vote. We have Geert Wilders, we have Le Pen, Giorgia Meloni's kind of an outlier, but nonetheless, we have this resurgent European right. What do you see as a potential timeline if we see a U.S. pullback in American support in defending Europe? What's going to happen with this European right, and how would they differ from the American right and their stances on kind of various issues surrounding, I guess, the defense of Europe? Looks different when it's your country, of course, but I'm interested to see how you see that going in the coming 5 years.
Well, I mean, I think the good news is that sort of what many people would consider the European far right hasn't been as successful as has sometimes been feared in recent elections. The bad news is that it still appears to be gaining strength rather than losing it. And the optimistic view of the outcome of Germany's elections is that the center held. The pessimistic view is that AfD has been gaining strength, and so maybe this is the center's last chance to show that it can sort of get things together if we're not going to see an even stronger performance from AfD in the next round of the elections. Without getting too far down into the weeds of this, I will say that the thing that has always struck me as very odd about the affinity that Vice President Vance and some others in sort of the MAGA movement seem to have for these European far-right parties is that these are anti-American parties, right? AfD is not positively disposed toward the United States. I don't think Marine Le Pen's party is particularly positively disposed toward the United States, at least as the United States has traditionally defined its objectives. And so you might get, if you get a Europe that is sort of more aligned with the MAGA movement in terms of having far-right parties come to power, it's not actually clear to me that that is a Europe that aligns more closely with the United States on diplomatic issues that a number of Republicans and Americans more broadly would care about.
Last question.
Hi.
Hi, I just probably asking a clarification question. So when you said like if Trump don't handle Ukraine well, that will become like he's Afghanistan. So I don't really understand the Afghanistan analogy, because there's a Soviet Union Afghanistan, there's a US Afghanistan, and also the future for Ukraine right now is not very rosy. So I don't know how this like I don't really understand how this could become like an Afghanistan situation for Trump.
Sure. So the point was that the U.S. basically stopped supporting the government of Afghanistan as a result of the peace deal that Trump signed in 2020 and then Biden executed in 2021. And that led to the fall of the Afghan government at the hands of the Taliban. And the danger is that if the United States were simply to terminate support to Ukraine or force Ukraine into a really bad, disadvantageous peace deal, you could see a similar collapse of Ukrainian resistance in the way that you saw in Afghanistan in 2021.
So you are one of the most prolific and insightful grand strategists that the U.S. has produced in my lifetime. But up until now, your career has not been a success because you lack one crucial item, which the capstone of your career will come now.
Oh boy.
With the AGS t-shirt.
Yes.
I love it. Thank you. Thank you.